Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Nilanjan Sarkar and I'm Deputy Director here at the South Asia Centre at the London School of Economics. A warm welcome to all of you, and including our panelists, whom I'm just going to introduce. We are very, very happy to be able to do this event this afternoon in the series of our country-focused events. This week's is on Nepal. And as I will say when I introduce the panelists, that I am particularly grateful to two of them who have lingered with the idea of this event for more than 2 years now, because we've been trying to put it together. But I'm really so glad that we've finally been able to bring this to all of you. I'd like to say a very warm and a big welcome and thank you to members of the audience who may be watching it now, or those who may be watching later, the recording. There has been enormous interest from across the world about this event. We've had a lot of signups, including people who've said that I've signed up, but I'm not going to be able to attend it, but I do look forward to listening to the recording later on. So in part also because it is very late in Nepal at the moment, late in the night. So we're very aware of that. So a very warm welcome to all of you and to those who will be joining in due course. This event is being conducted via Zoom, but all of you are actually watching it on YouTube. And as you will notice, the chat function in YouTube is enabled. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please do post it in the chat box on YouTube, and I will pose it to the panelists once they've made their initial remarks. You are very welcome to pose a question to an individual particular panelist, in which case please mention them by name. You're equally welcome to pose a question to the entire panel, and I will pose it to them, to all of them. If you would like to tweet, then please do, and please do tag us, the South Asia Centre, as well as individual panelists whose Twitter handles you will find in the details of the YouTube page where you're watching it at the moment. So that if you do tweet, please do tag us. One final thought, which is that had this event been held on site at LSE, members of the audience at LSE have the right to remain anonymous while posing a question. And in keeping with the spirit of that, when I ask questions, I will not be revealing the names of those who are posing questions, though I know that for a lot of you, your names will be visible on YouTube, but at least we will remain as close as we can to the spirit. Before I introduce the panelists, just a very, very short description of the thoughts that went into putting this panel together. The roundtable it's meant to focus on disaster governance in Nepal. It's the story at the heart of it, devastating earthquakes of 2015, Nepal's recovery from that over the last 7 years, not only its actual material tangible recovery that we can see, but also how it has equipped itself, if it has, and what else could be done in terms of preparing for future such disasters. How it can inform policy frameworks to mitigate future hazards, and also to perhaps dwell upon how this has impacted people's lives and livelihoods, how their lives and livelihoods are affected by the institutional structures intended to prepare and respond to such crises in future. It is now my very pleasant task to introduce all the speakers to you. The order in which I introduce them is the order in which we have agreed that they will speak. All speakers have been invited to make initial remarks of roughly between 6 and 8 minutes, after which there will be a moderated discussion, and we will also pose your questions. So please go ahead and ask questions that you would like to be posed to them. Our first speaker is Sarah Schneiderman. Sarah is Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, at the Institute of Asian Research at the University of British Columbia, and is currently involved in a transdisciplinary research project on Nepal's post-earthquake reconstruction, amongst others. I say amongst others because when I was reading Sarah's webpage, I noticed that I could actually write about 2 more paragraphs that were entirely relevant to this afternoon's discussion, but I wanted to keep it very, very focused, and that's what I've done for all the others. But Sarah, welcome. Nimesh Dhungana is lecturer in disasters and global health at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. And we never fail to say that he has been at LSE. Nimesh's doctoral research, which he completed in 2019, examined the politics of citizens' participation and accountability following the 2015 earthquakes. Katie Oven is Vice-Chancellor Senior Fellow in Geography and Environmental Sciences at Northumbria University, researching social vulnerability and resilience to disasters, with a particular focus on earthquakes and landslides, with empirical research done in Nepal, India, and Kazakhstan. Shobhana Pradhan is Nepal Country Director at BBC Media Action, the BBC's international development charity. Our discussant for the afternoon is Romola Sanyal, who is Associate Professor in Urban Geography at LSE and member of the Faculty Advisory Group of the LSE South Asia Center. So this afternoon's event is not the only role Romola plays at the center. Before I hand over to Sarah, I did want to say that this event owes a lot to Romola's and Sarah's participation over the last several months as we've been trying to put it together, got put off because of the pandemic. It was supposed to be an on-site event at one time, but we are here together this afternoon. So Sarah, please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Nilanjan, for that generous introduction, and thank you for making this happen. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak with all of you and also everybody who's listening today, wherever you are. I'm pleased to be joining you from my home on the traditional unceded ancestral territory of the Musqueam people near the University of British Columbia campus in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And I've had the privilege of being based here for just over 7 years, having moved here just a few months before Nepal experienced its devastating earthquakes in the spring of 2015. For this reason, my own experience and understanding of this place that I now call home is intimately intertwined with the experience of disaster in Nepal. And as we now think more about how to respond to and prepare for future disasters here in BC after the wildfires of last summer, as well as the floods and landslides of November, which cut off our city of Vancouver from all supply routes for several weeks and also made international news, perhaps you heard about it then, I'm ever more inspired by the hard work and creativity that I've observed in Nepal as people and communities across the country work to transform the grief and loss of 2015 into new pathways for the future. The government of Nepal and the international donors that support it have also played a critical role in establishing new frameworks for disaster governance. Looking at all of this from my vantage point here in BC, there's much to learn from. So today I want to share a few key insights that are emerging from the collaborative research project that I've been coordinating for the past 5 years since 2017. That was titled Expertise, Labor and Mobility in Nepal's Post-Conflict, Post-Disaster Reconstruction, Construction, Finance and Law as Domains of Transformation. This was funded by the Canadian Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and brought together over 20 team members from different disciplines. We worked in partnership with Social Science Baha and the Tribhuvan University Central Department of Anthropology in Nepal. And I'll share some links to this project later on. Working with this team also brought me into conversation with Katie Oven and Shobhana Pradhan, who are here with us today via the Sajak Nepal project, which I'm sure you'll hear more about from them. I've also continued to conduct my own long-term ethnographic research in Dolakha district, where I've been engaged as an anthropologist with the Pangmi community for over 25 years since the late 1990s. By drawing upon all of these experiences, I'd like to offer some brief insight into what has happened in Nepal since the earthquakes and what it may mean for global efforts to plan for the many disasters that we all know are coming. Our research in the project I was describing initially identified the domains of construction, finance, and law as areas where the earthquakes of 2015 spurred massive transformation. We later added heritage to this list of keywords. In the construction domain, we observed how the National Reconstruction Authority's private housing reconstruction subsidies led to a complete reshaping of the built environment across earthquake-affected Nepal, particularly in rural areas. Many settlements are almost now unrecognizable for people who had been familiar with their look and feel and lived experience before 2015. And this is largely due to an explosion of new building styles enforced by the nominally owner-driven reconstruction approach implemented by the NRA. The NRA is the National Reconstruction Authority, just to be clear. In this program, roughly $3,000 were allocated for the reconstruction of each destroyed house. But this was not enough to build a complete home in compliance with the mandated earthquake resilient designs. This is where finance came in. Beyond the initial challenges of establishing bank accounts to receive subsidies, often in regions where no bank branches had previously existed, house owners had to complement the grant amount through their own savings, loans, and in many cases, remittances. This situation led to new processes of financialization as people's livelihoods became ever more entangled with formal financial institutions. Along the way, earthquake-affected people had to reconceptualize their own relationships with law and governance. For example, in places where homes had always been self-constructed with no oversight, suddenly, people required permission from state agents, often engineers, to construct their own homes. This experience raised questions about what citizenship actually meant and for whom. In other words, who was empowered to make claims upon the state? The answer to this question shaped outcomes in the realm of private housing as much as a parallel question did in the public space of heritage reconstruction. What kind of material culture was deemed significant enough to national identity to receive additional funding and support to rebuild structures such as temples and monasteries? All of this was happening, these questions were being asked right at the moment of devolution from a unitary to a federal state, as the process of post-conflict state restructuring initiated by the 2006 Comprehensive Peace Agreement that ended the Maoist state civil conflict in Nepal reached fruition through the 2015 Constitution and 2017 administrative restructuring. A new administrative landscape was made up of provinces and palikas instead of districts and village development committees, and this was overlaid on the already earthquake reconfigured terrain. These transformations set the stage for new systems of governance intended to mitigate future disasters. The new National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Authority, or NDRRMA, was established through the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2017, which came into force in 2019 and took up the mantle of the NRA after its mandate expired just at the end of last year, 2021. This new federal agency delegates authority to the provincial disaster management committees, which in turn oversee district and municipal level disaster management committees. How this system and the jurisdictional relationships are actually working is part of what our new SAJAG project is exploring. Regardless of the outcomes, the fact that Nepal now has this relatively robust structure for disaster governance is a direct result of the 2015 earthquakes. And that's one of the things that I think is interesting here. And in terms of how we frame this roundtable is really thinking not only about recovery from the earthquakes as a singular catastrophic event, but rather how that process has actually shaped the entire landscape, both literally in terms of how the built environment and environment around us is reconfigured, but also in terms of the landscape of governance, how that has been shaped by that one event as we orient towards future disasters. It's very clear that the upheaval in the wake of those seismic events led to a strong recognition by both house owners and elected officials, as well as donors, that the country's terrain put its citizens at the intersection of many possible future disasters. Not only earthquakes, but floods, landslides, and wildfires, not to mention the global pandemic. Establishing structures and mechanisms for anticipating and responding effectively to these future disasters is actually a significant accomplishment, especially if these structures of governance can recognize the inequalities that lead to disparate forms of vulnerability. In this sense, I think the rest of the world, such as us here in BC, has quite a lot to learn from Nepal's experience and future thinking. And some of the key points here are the setup of a system of governance that actually has clear, at least in theory, lines of communication across the different levels of governance and mechanisms for people at all levels of that to feed back in their experiences and needs. And another key point that emerged from our research project is about some of the unintended outcomes of conditionality in terms of the subsidies for post-disaster housing reconstruction. And that's something that I hope will also be part of the conversation here in BC as we go forward to thinking about how to respond to wildfires, landslides, and floods. Thank you very much for listening. I hope I've been able to give you just a very brief overview of some of the key dynamics that have been occurring. I look forward to speaking with everybody further in our discussion period.
Thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful, absolutely. And yes, please do post the link in the chat box so we can send it to members of the audience. May I now invite Dr. Nimesh Dhungana, who is lecturer in disasters and global health at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the University of Manchester. Nimesh's doctoral research, which he completed in 2019, examined the politics of citizen participation and accountability following the 2015 earthquakes. Nimesh, please speak now. You have about 8 minutes.
Thanks, Nilanjan, for organizing this event and also for the opportunity to participate. So as we know, next month marks the 7th anniversary of the 2015 Nepal earthquake. So I think this is an opportune time for us to sort of reflect on some of the accomplishments in terms of disaster governance, but also the shortcomings. So I think I'll be focusing on that for this talk. And as a disaster scholar, in my work, I mostly look at disaster as not just as a site of suffering, humanitarian suffering, but I also look at political possibility for change, including change in governance norms, frameworks, policy discourse, and guidelines, and also practices. So that is something that I've been sort of longitudinally looking at in the wake of the 2015 Nepal earthquake. So most of my research initially has been more qualitative ethnographic research that I had the opportunity to do in the immediate aftermath of the 2015 earthquake in 2015, as you mentioned, Nilanjan, as part of my PhD work. But more recently, I've been mostly looking at more remotely some of the policy discourses and guidelines. So I'll be for today's talk, I'll primarily try to center on that and what kind of changes that we've seen since 2015 earthquake. So if you really ask me a question about what kind of changes, whether there's been real changes in the governance of disaster in Nepal, or do we see some kind of continuities or maybe some further entrenchment of some kind of some norms and frameworks and values that created the disaster or that enabled the disaster in the first place? So my answer to that would be both yes and no, because yes, in the sense that yes, after the 2015 earthquake, Nepal has made some really sort of impressive, I would say quite impressive progress in terms of the policy and structural changes. And I would like to give some examples to illustrate that. So the first one, 2015, immediately after the 2015 earthquake, Nepal introduced the post-disaster need assessment framework that came out less than 2 months after the earthquake, which explicitly sort of mentioned about the more participatory and accountable governance of the disaster, which is something that I focus on. How do we make disaster more democratic and just? And part of that policy framework also talks about strengthening accountability processes, working collaboratively with civil society, ensuring rule of law and other kinds of things. And it is also aligned with other sort of pre-existing governance policy discourses that existed in Nepal prior to the earthquake. Then in 2015, late in 2015, the National Reconstruction Act was promulgated, which also paved way for the the establishment of the National Reconstruction Authority. And it explicitly talked about sustainable, resilient, and social justice-based approach to longer-term reconstruction. So, from a much more short-term emergency-focused approach to disaster preparedness and response, it talked about much more longer-term, resilient, and social justice approach. So that is something that we can know. Whether that has been translated into a practice or not is a separate question, but at least there was that kind of policy commitment. In 2017, as Sarah already mentioned, through the parliament, Nepal also passed a new act, National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act, which actually replaced the 1982, which frankly was an outdated act called Natural Calamity Relief Act. And it really, this new act talks about, it takes a much more holistic, much more integrated approach to disaster risk reduction. And the focus is more on preparedness, taking preventive action as opposed to emergency and short-term response. So that I see also as another kind of major progress in disaster governance. In line with the post-disaster need assessment that came out in the wake of the 2015 earthquake, the National Reconstruction Authority also institutionalized grievance handling mechanism that was part of the reconstruction effort. So it has a very robust, in some way, robust system of grievance handling mechanisms as part of the reconstruction effort. And more recently, the government has established National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Authority, which again, it shows the commitment to take a much more longer-term, holistic, and integrated approach to disaster risk reduction and preparedness. And as Sarah already mentioned, last December, the National Reconstruction Authority ceased to exist, and it handed over its role and responsibility and remaining reconstruction work to this particular new authority. So there is also this kind of succession planning, as you can see in the way disaster is being viewed, approach from a much more institutionalized and sort of government-based approach to governance. But when you see the implementation side of this, that's where you see the cracks start to appear. And my own ethnographic research has also revealed some of those challenges in the implementation of this governance mechanism. Because although despite the commitment for participation and accountability in the policy discourse, the way the National Reconstruction Authority coordinated and implemented the reconstruction was extremely sort of top-down in approach. There was a provision for what they call owner-driven reconstruction, but that was, I sort of said, extremely nominal in the way it was implemented. There was very limited consultation with the affected communities. There was very little consultation about the way the eligibility of the affected communities were determined, how the housing grant was structured and implemented. So, although there was policy commitment, the way it was translated, we see there's some major gaps. At the same time, the National Reconstruction Authority, although it's made some major progress, much of what it has done in the past few years has been heavily focused on promoting or celebrating the success of reconstruction, particularly in regards to private housing, and that you can see in the way the reconstruction stories have been communicated through press releases, even in your website. So if you go to the website, for example, of the National Reconstruction Authority, right, it is extremely impressive. It says that almost 90% of the houses that were, that was surveyed as needing reconstruction have been either completed. The houses have been either completed or in the process of being completed, rebuilt. Extremely impressive record. But it doesn't mention anything about the quality of those houses. It mostly mentions about a number of houses. So there is also this politics of number and measurement in which this success has been circulated, publicized. Same with the grievances. There are mechanisms of grievance handling mechanism that was been established. It says, over 600,000 grievances were being lodged to the National Reconstruction Authority, and most of them have been addressed, which is very impressive. Again, according to the data. But what were the nature of the grievances? How they were structured? Whether people have been satisfied with the way those grievances have been handled, right? So those are really, and in those if you look at it, if you through those lens, it is extremely opaque about the way this has been, the whole thing has been handled. So just to conclude, I think the way the reconstruction sort of has been governed in the wake of 2015 earthquake, in terms of the establishment of sort of new frameworks, policy discourse, and guidelines, government has made some major accomplishment in the way there has been much more longer term integrated approach to moving away from a much more emergency and short term approach to disaster preparedness and response. There has been a lot more longer term approach to response, but in the way it has been translated into practice, the implementation side of this is still a major gaps. Been very weak consultation with the communities who've been affected. There's also, it also goes beyond the 2015 Nepal earthquake, and there are also other kind of institutional structures, systems that needed to be set up, including the early warning system to prepare for future disaster. And these are some of these real concrete mechanisms that the government needs to be set up. And in the absence of that, we've seen not just the 2015 earthquake, other kind of reoccurring disaster. In 2019, there was a major tornado in the southern part of the Nepal that was created a major destruction. More recently, there was a development-induced disaster in Sindhu Palchok district, where a major water project was destroyed, again linked to the lack of early warning system. So all those systems have not been yet to be institutionalized, and there is also a lot need to be done in those regards in terms of what needs to be happening. So I'll end there, and maybe I can, if there are any questions, I can take that later. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Nimesh. We're going to move quickly on to our next speaker, but before that, if I could just remind the audience that you're very welcome to ask questions, and I can see some that are already coming in, but you're very welcome to ask questions. Please do type them in the chat box on YouTube, and we will post them to the panelists once all the speakers have made their initial remarks. Our next speaker is Dr. Katie Oven, who is Vice-Chancellor, Senior Fellow in Geography and Environmental Sciences at Northumbria University, is researching social vulnerability and resilience to disasters, with a particular focus on earthquakes and landslides, with empirical research done in Nepal, India, and Kazakhstan. Katie, welcome. You have about 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the panel today. So to contextualize my comments, I'm a geographer working at the intersection of human and physical geography, with a particular interest in hazard, risk, disaster, and development. And I completed my PhD research in Nepal, focusing on landslide vulnerability in Sindhu Palchok from 2005 to 2008. And since then, I've worked on several projects focusing on risk governance, including in relation to the National Geohazard Assessment that was undertaken after the 2015 earthquakes. And I want to reflect on that a little bit today. In particular, I want to look at the period after the earthquake, the changing hazard and risk context, and the implications for risk governance moving forward. And to do this, I'm going to draw on research undertaken as part of a UK, or was DFID, now FCDO, NERC SHEAR funded project. That stands for the Science for Humanitarian Emergencies and Resilience funded project. I'm going to draw on that today, and also reflect forward to a new project that Sarah, Shobhana, and myself are all involved in, called Sajog, Nepal. So how have the 2015 earthquake shaped policy to mitigate future hazard? Well, Nepal's susceptibility to earthquakes prior to 2015 was very well known, with people commonly talking about a large earthquake in the far west. And so in this context, the Gorkha earthquake, with its sort of footprint over rural central Nepal, was perhaps a surprise. Well, from a sort of scientific point of view, it remains impossible to say when, where, and what the next earthquake will be. We nonetheless know what the broad impacts will be, irrespective of exactly which earthquake happens next. What's interesting then, from my perspective, is that there's been a really strong focus on making buildings less dangerous through retrofitting, training local masons, etc. But much less consideration has been given to secondary hazards such as landslides. It's important to note that in a mountain region earthquake like Gorkha, typically between 30 and 40% of people who die will die from landslides. Whilst it's obvious that buildings need to be strong, there is a real need to make sure that buildings are also constructed in the best possible locations. You will have all seen, I'm sure, examples of schools which withstood the shaking, but which were impacted by landslides, either on the day of the earthquake or in the weeks or months that followed. In the context of landslides, we know that small distances make a big difference in terms of exposure. There is therefore a clear argument for trying to find ways to better use what we already know about the physical processes, such as landslides, that happen during the earthquake to reduce exposure through, for example, risk-sensitive land use planning and related policy. The further challenge in this planning and mitigation is the way in which earthquakes are considered to be often single short-term events. Yet our research has shown that in the case of mountain earthquakes, the legacy of damage to the landscape sustained during the shaking can persist for several years or more. For example, the number of landslides in the landscape is higher today than it was on the day after the earthquake in 2015. What this suggests is, in planning for the next earthquake, we need to be thinking not just of the period of initial shaking, but of a largely predictable period of elevated hazard and risk in the years that follow. As a very tangible example of this, after the monsoon in 2015, 6 months after the earthquake, we saw an enormous amount of investment being made in the rebuilding of hydropower. Yet in subsequent years, we've seen reconstructed projects destroyed as landslide debris continues to be reworked. Another important aspect of the legacy of the earthquake is that the landscape may have fundamentally changed, with people potentially exposed to new forms of hazard and risk. A very tangible example of this is that after an earthquake, the amount of rainfall needed to generate risky conditions can be significantly less. So tacit knowledge around environmental cues for when and what is risky may be less reliable and even misleading, giving a false sense of security. A further manifestation of this is that what was safe to do before the earthquake may not be safe to do now. An example of this is rural road construction. Since the 2017 elections, we've seen a significant increase in rural road construction and a corresponding burgeoning impact of landslides, particularly in areas worst affected by the earthquake, suggesting building roads is now far more risky. To give you an idea of the scale of this, our analysis indicates that the landslide impact from rural road construction is the equivalent to that experienced during the earthquake in 2015. So what does all this mean for disaster governance in Nepal? The 2015 earthquakes certainly highlighted the need for a more proactive approach to landslide risk management, something that has been talked about for a long time, and which featured in the National Strategy for Disaster Risk Management, the interim policy before the ratification of the relatively recent Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act. The earthquake saw a need for a rapid assessment of geohazard risk, and this was undertaken, starting before the establishment of the NRA, the National Reconstruction Authority, and then taken forward by the NRA itself. For those of you less familiar with the Geohazard assessment, this involved the assessment of landslide impacted settlements across the 14 earthquake affected districts, with the aim of identifying areas where there was a risk to life. This was an ambitious assessment, but it was also problematic. The problem of landslide hazard and risk was recognised, action was taken, but it failed to take into account the dynamic nature of the landscape. The policy ended up playing catch up as who was at risk was changing rapidly. The policy sought to move people out of harm's way, but this is not easy or necessarily a desirable thing to do for the settlements impacted. And of course, there's the inherent uncertainty at the local slope scale in terms of what may or may not happen in the future. What then are the implications for mitigating future hazards? Well, our experience suggests that there is often useful scientific information available, but there remains a significant gap in terms of making this usable. And this is very much a focus of our Sajak Nepal project. Much of the science is commonly not developed with the actual problem in mind. Equally, there has in the past been very limited capacity at the Palika level to implement disaster risk reduction initiatives, and in particular to move from a reactive to a proactive approach. This will perhaps change as the new federal structures develop and as local politicians are held accountable by their electorate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katie. That was wonderful and succinct. I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of this, but now may I invite Shobhana Pradhan, who is Nepal Country Director at BBC Media Action, the BBC's international development charity. Shobhana, please speak now. You have about 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this discussion. I will focus more on the role of media and communications, particularly drawing on BBC Media Action's work with communities, local media, and government, starting with the NRA. And I mean, we're working right now with the NDRRMA, so I will draw on that as well. So just going back, you know, since I was a child, I've always heard that a major earthquake in Kathmandu Valley occurs every 75 years or so. The last big one, I was always told since I was a kid, was the one that occurred in 1934, measuring 8.3 on the Richter scale. So I think almost all Nepalis have been told stories about the Nabbe Saal Ko Bhuitalo that destroyed everything in Kathmandu. True, we had a smaller one in 1988, but even then we've been talking about an impending disaster as early as 2010. And since 2011 would have hit the 75-year mark, we knew a big one was coming, but none of us were really truly prepared, even though it was, everybody had been talking about it. True, we had the act, such as the Natural Calamity Relief Act, which has been discussed already. Some building codes had been updated, and there was some system in place to respond to disaster. However, as you know, effectiveness and implementation capacity were still major challenges. So I'm going to speak a bit about the media here. With this earthquake in 2015, we realized that the media sector in Nepal were not prepared at all. Nepal, despite being a very small country, is very, very media dense. Looking back at 2015, there was television, radio, print, some online media coverages were all around the country, but none were really prepared to address a disaster of this scale, even though we had been discussing it quite a bit. Media persons were not trained, and none actually had contingency plans in place. Most Nepali media, only used to producing and broadcasting highly political current news and affairs and entertainment, were at a loss about how to start programming to address the immediate needs of people, such as where to find shelter, food, water, medicine, etc. The existing act at the time, the Natural Calamity Relief Act of '82, did not fully recognize the important role of media and communications at the time of disaster. I think interestingly, the state broadcaster Radio Nepal was one of the very few that was able to jump immediately into action, providing information for people impacted directly by the earthquake. And we've done a lot of research since then, which shows that at times of disaster, people tend to turn to the radio for trusted source of information, especially when it comes from the government, which is, And so actually, just speaking about our experience at BBC Media Action, on the very day of the earthquake, we were able to work with the BBC Language Services to launch our Lifeline program, Milijuli Nepali. But this was only possible due to the fact that we had run preparatory training, done several simulations, and had set up systems in place, and had an ongoing partnership with Radio Nepal. We'd done a suitcase radio training with them. Unfortunately, they had one. We were able to start broadcasting immediately. The strength of the program, Milijuli Nepali, was that we provided trusted, verified, simple, and practical messaging communicated to people in their own colloquial style, and motivating message that really sparked hope. Even though it was a really, really hopeless situation, sparked hope rather than despair. So I think it's really important when we talk about disaster, life-saving information about first aid, building temporary shelters, purifying contaminated water, protecting children in shelters is equally as important as shelter, food, and medicine. So I think the programming at the time that we worked together, of course, as part of the BBC, but with the state broadcaster as well, helped to establish that information is indeed aid as well as with the others. So learnings from the earthquake have meant that all ensuing policies, acts drafted after this time clearly include the importance of media and communications. So you can say as you can see, the DRRM Act of 2017, fresh from the learnings of 2015, has prioritized not only immediate response, but preparedness for effective response. It also speaks about the establishment of an authority to strengthen DRRM and preparedness activities, with a clear mandate to develop disaster information management systems. Testament to the fact that if there's will and commitment for significant and much needed costs, it can actually be materialized. As you can see, the NDRRMA, was established as part of the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act in December 2019. And the ensuing DRRM action plan is also clearly aligned with the Sendai framework for DRR. As in the Sendai framework, Nepal's DRRM action plan also has 4 priority areas. I think I won't go through all of it, but just wanted to highlight is that in the first priority area of the action plan, 4 priority actions have been identified. And one of these priority actions is about media and communications, which was not there before. The effective use of all types of media to raise awareness about disasters, communication coordination amongst government institutions, international development organizations, private sectors, and others for disaster risk communication, strategic communication targeting vulnerable groups, which is so important. So actually, even at present, at BBC Media Action, we've been working closely with the NDRRMA in developing a DRR communication strategy that will guide all communications, all comms around disasters in the country. This does not just help us prepare. Katie talked not just about, earthquakes, but the need to prepare for other disasters, like but floods, right? Because that's, when you have earthquakes, you can't just focus on that, because floods, landslides, we know that they will follow as well. But others like fire, wildfire, lightning, windstorms, and also silent killers such as snake bites. So in this strategy with the NDRRMA, we've identified hotspots for these disasters. We've identified major communications channels, languages, influencers to communicate risk about these disasters, and a lot more. So all of these have been very, very positive developments. Unfortunately, as human beings, we tend to forget the memories of disasters like this with the passage of time. So despite the lessons of the past, even now, majority of media outlets do not have any contingency plans of their own, nor do they have any trained human resources in place to respond to these disasters. So I'll just give you an example of Sindhu Palchok district, which was the most affected by the 2015 earthquake. Recently, when this area was hit by massive floods and landslides, none of the local media in the area were prepared for this disaster or had any contingency plan. So that means the broadcasting completely stopped, and it took at least a week before information could be provided to the people in need. So I think this definitely is an area to be prioritized. And as part of the Sajak Nepal project, we're working with local media in preparing these contingency plans as well. So I think speaking about the way forward in the media and communication sector, there's a real need to invest in the capacity building of media, whether it is at the local, regional, or national level. We need to work together to provide training, mentoring support for local media to strengthen the capacity to produce and disseminate programming about DRR as envisaged in the DRRM action plan. But besides just production skills, we would need to put in more focus on editorial values, JASI principles, aid accountability, lifeline approaches, and a lot more. So as we say at the BBC, we put audiences at the heart of everything, all programming. So all programs, whatever they do when we talk about disasters, should not just be about people, but really for people. So with that, I'd like to end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shobhana. That was absolutely wonderful. We're now going to be, I should make an announcement once again that please do send in your questions. And I'm now going to invite Romola to start the discussion, to make her comments and to start the discussion. And I will keep coming in at irregular intervals to pose questions. But Dr. Romola Sanyal is Associate Professor in Urban Geography at LSE and is also a member of the Faculty Advisory Group of the LSE South Asia Center. Romola.
Thanks so much, Nilanjan. And thank you to all the panelists for such a stimulating conversation. I have certainly learned a lot from it, and I'm sure that the audience has also learned a lot from it and also enjoyed this extraordinary discussion. So I want to again start by sort of thanking everybody for being here. And it is a real honor to be asked to be a discussant for this session. Now, I come to this discussion from my own disciplinary background in geography, but also as somebody who works primarily within India. So in a sense, I am somewhat of an outsider in the particular country context. But I hope what I will do today is tie the discussions from this panel to some of the work that I have done in the past, as well as reflect on some of the themes that have emerged today in a few minutes, and I will be as succinct as possible. My own work in both in the Middle East, in Lebanon, and in South Asia, in India, has earlier focused on displacement and urbanization and understanding the ways in which cities come to be crafted through processes and politics of displacement. My argument has long been that the act of building itself is an act of politics. Especially as I spent my time amongst displaced communities, understanding the social and spatial struggles they faced as they built their precarious structures into solid homes. So in my work, I sort of excavate the ways in which material matters, land matters, legal status matters in all of these narratives. Now, my current work, however, has shifted over to think about the city as the site of experimentation by humanitarian organizations as they sharpen their tools and skills of intervention, especially in the aftermath of crises and disasters. I see these crises then as frontiers of knowledge production about humanitarian assistance, as commodities that are created through experimentation on the ground and channeled up through networks of experts and circulated around the world through humanitarian aid networks. Here I see the intersection of different actors at different scales and how their authority and actions continually shift as crisis response evolves. One particular area that is of interest to me is the local or municipal government that is often overlooked in the standard discussions and negotiations around aid and aid management. And this is something that local governments have repeatedly also raised as an issue. This despite the fact that local governments are at the forefront of managing crises as it impacts their communities, their territories, and their finances. I consider how this local space comes to become global and how global ideas become messy and modified as they quote unquote land. So following a lot of the critical literature on policy mobilities in geography. Now, while not specifically about disasters as the kind that was discussed today, and in my experience, there seems to be a superficial divide around environmental versus conflict-related disasters, although I'm sure Nimesh will disagree on that point, or maybe we'll have a different view. But certainly in much of the academic literature, this divide persists. I think there's an interesting conversation that can be had around this work and the presentations. So I'm going to make a couple of comments about sort of some of the broad ideas that came forward from the panel's discussions. The first thing I want to do is sort of open with the panel's comments, and more generally that much of the work reminded me of the work of my colleague Austin Zeiderman and his work on Endangered City. And in it, he looks at how the discourses of disasters, security, and risk reshape the relations between city officials and the poor, and in turn also reshapes urban politics. So I would want perhaps the panel even if they haven't sort of read this work, to kind of think about what does this discourse around disasters, around security and risk do in terms of reshaping these relationships, and going to some of the comments that had been made by Nimesh as well as Katie around, who is allowed to participate in what ways. I'd also like to invite Katie to speak about what the politics of science are that are produced. I'm particularly interested, going back to this point about frontiers of knowledge, I want to draw on this. And I want to sort of take this back and tie this back to this question around the frontiers of knowledge. So I want to sort of ask, how does Nepal become a site of learning, as Sarah suggests? What possibilities, networks, imaginations, and hauntings constitute that imagination? How does the Nepali media play a role in producing these or different imaginaries and learnings? Now, Sarah made some really interesting points, quite a few fascinating points for me today. And she talked about sort of how earthquake affected people had to reconceptualize their own relationships with law and governance. For example, in places where homes had always been self-constructed with no oversight, suddenly people required permission from state agents, often engineers, to construct their own homes. And this experience raised questions about what citizenship actually meant and for whom. In other words, who was empowered to make claims on the state? I found that question quite interesting, and various questions also that Sarah raised around financialization. So I want to sort of think about how disasters also enable the tentacles of neoliberal finance to extend into places that are not linked to the global financial landscape as we know it. So we've seen this happening quite a bit within the sort of the financialization of informal settlements in the global south. So I want to sort of invite us to kind of think about, how disasters also create these kinds of conditions under which these are extended. I also want to ask what kinds of new relationships come about between people and their homes now that they are mediated through permissions from state agents and engineers. This question is also directed at Nimesh. How does the intervention of engineers affect traditional or local knowledge of building or reconstruction? In parallel with that, I want to sort of also ask, moving back on to a different scale, I want to sort of come back because I had said that I'm quite interested in these discussions around local governments who tend to be overlooked. I want to ask about the role of the local government and how they're able to participate in the imagination of futures, and how the people themselves are able to participate in the imagination of futures. And specifically to Nimesh, I would like to also ask a bit more about this question on participation. So this might be a very specific question, it's just a matter of curiosity for me, perhaps, but who is able to participate, and is anyone effectively excluded as a result of their immigration or legal status? Because this is often the case in many other crisis affected countries, where those who are in fact displaced because they come from elsewhere are not effectively included in the governance systems that are set up in the post-crisis landscape. So I think that again, it's been a huge pleasure and privilege for me to be part of this panel and to be invited as a discussant for it. And I hope that the questions that I asked are interesting and help us to sort of take the conversation in different directions. So thank you again, and I will open it up to the panel to respond.
Great. Thanks a lot, Romola. That was really wonderful. That really was. Thank you so much. The only reason I butted in is that, Sarah, there is a question that is related to one of the points that Romola made, which is about the financial impact recovery of the government treasury in not only because of 2015 earthquakes and since, but also post-COVID. So if you could include it whenever you're responding to the things that Romola said. Shall we just go round in a clockwise direction as I can see? Should we start with Nimesh?
Sure. So thanks, Romola. A really stimulating set of questions. I don't know where to start, but maybe I'll start with the one on participation, because I think that's really close to my research. Much of my initial research was focused on the first 1.5 years after the earthquake, and that's where I sort of did much of my ethnographic research. And so the way who is able to participate and not, that is actually if you see that the much more sort of intrinsic idea of participation as a democratic right? So everybody should be able to participate, but that is one way of thinking about it. But in the wake of the earthquake, the way the participation was structured was very much the way the National Reconstruction Authority, which was in charge of pursuing or overseeing the reconstruction, that was how it was. The authority that was seeing how the participation was structured. So one example is that people were able to voice their concerns, like their issues, or how they want their houses to be rebuilt, or what kind of assistance they would require. So they had the ability to do that. But in order to do that, one thing is that they first needed to prove eligibility as an affected household whose house has been destroyed. So it was like eligibility. So it was sort of a conditional participation in the sense. So in order to be able to voice in the official channel, which is the grievance redressal mechanism, you first need to prove your eligibility as a victim. So that is how it is structured. So it is like the power of the formal system of participation is. You can also see that who is able to participate also in your ethnographic research. That in my ethnographic research, where I had the opportunity to participate in some of the community meetings, public hearings, actually organized not by the state, although the authority was expected to, as part of its policy commitment, it was supposed to organize public hearings as part of participation and consultation. I didn't come across any. I haven't come across any that the authority did. But communities themselves, civil society organized public hearings. So I was able to participate in some of them, and you will see some pre-existing problem of participation that creep in this forum. Like women would mostly, there will be very few women who will be participating. Communities who've been excluded communities. If they are participating, they would mostly be in the margin, right? Really outside these public hearings, and most people who are participating are local sort of elderly men. So it's really that it's not just in disaster, it's something that we've seen in other development activities in Nepal and other parts of South Asia, and how participation in these forums perpetuate some kind of this pre-existing inequality. So it's also about, I don't have much to say about the legality of participation, like in terms of people, that I didn't come across it. But in terms of participation, I think the way it was handling, I would say in summary, the way it was very much stifled by the way the state was seeing participation, one. And I think, and secondly, it also reproduced some of the pre-existing sort of political inequalities in the way the participation happened in actual these forums. I'll stop here. Maybe I should give other an opportunity, but if I have a chance, I can come back to your first point on risk communication, because I think that's super interesting. But I'll let other people respond.
Sure, thanks a lot, Nimesh.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll have time to discuss that as well. There was also the other point that Romola made, which was very interesting, was about how the intervention of engineers was going to affect and impact traditional house building and construction techniques, which I think is very, very interesting. Even when, say, someone like me who studies medieval history looks at how domestic spaces were built and the materials that were used and how it changes in South Asian contexts. I'm actually going clockwise according to my screen. I realized I was just looking up and I realized it's not the same as what people can see on YouTube. So people may be wondering. So I'm now going by YouTube. So it's going to be Sarah next. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much. And it's been wonderful to hear everybody's thoughts on these topics. Romola, I really appreciate your comments and thank you for the direction to look at Austin Zeiderman's work, and especially for the sort of framing of this sort of crisis that the earthquakes were as a frontier of knowledge production. I think that's really important. And that also connects for me to the point that Katie made about earthquakes not being a singular event, but rather being a long-term process, which affects not only the landscape and people's lived experience, but as we've all been saying, structures of governance and so forth. So, I mean, if we think about it in that kind of frontier sort of metaphor, then it's like the earthquake is actually a beginning rather than an end. And I think that that's a very powerful way to kind of frame much of what we're saying here. So some of your specific questions, I'm happy to take up, particularly around how people have had to reconceptualize their relationship with the state. And that's been one of the main foci of the work in the project I've been involved with, as well as my own ongoing ethnographic work. So on the question of financialization, we do have a paper that came out of our project on this theme, which was published in Development and Change, and that was led by my colleague Philippe Levillon at UBC as well. So you can take a look there. I can post a link to that later for more detail. But basically, in that paper, we try to nuance or push back against some of the narratives around disaster capitalism, which I think are well established in thinking through disasters and their aftermath in many parts of the world. Not to say that that is wrong, that it doesn't happen, but that it doesn't tell the full story when we think only of capital as this sort of juggernaut that drives through communities and leaves sort of like abject lack of agency in its wake. We have a different view, which is really focusing on financialization as a broader suite of experiences, which can include disaster capitalism, but is not exclusive to it. And we make the point also that experiences of financialization are very variegated, depending upon people's socioeconomic circumstances and also geographical location, that it really matters whether there's a bank branch in your village or not in terms of how you are going to experience this. And that, yes, while there's an element of neoliberal finance extending and certainly people becoming enrolled in financial systems that they were not previously subject to, that's very much the case. We make the argument that there are potentials for agency in those contexts as well. And I mean, this really came out through the interviews that we did, that, there were people who were very upset about the ways that the banking process worked, and for good reason, because, there were really a lot of challenges for people to access funds. But we also talked with people who really felt that they were benefiting from the sort of increased attention in a way from financial institutions, which were then enabling them access to other forms of capital and integration with the market economy, which is desirable for a lot of people due to larger scale structural transformations of livelihoods, which have been ongoing for a long time. So in that sense, I think it's really important to see the kind of questions around finance and neoliberalism as sort of situated in local contexts, and also not as this kind of absolute sort of negative experience, although it has those elements, but also situated within the broader socioeconomic transformations that people are already experiencing. And then, yes, the question of new relationships between people and their homes, that's something that's really also been at the core of our research, and that many of us are speaking about in different ways. And we also have some work coming out about that, but it's not quite there yet. I'll share more about that later in due course. But really, I think that as I mentioned already, many people had to reconceptualize what their home might be and think about this sort of built structure as something different than it had been in the past. And because of the constraints that people were under in terms of finances, but also in terms of the approved designs, it meant that people had to make a certain set of choices. And so there have been many unintended consequences of that, where many of the post-earthquake structures that are, in sort of technical terms, more resilient than what was there before, many of them are not actually used as primary homes. They're often used for storage or even for animals. So there may actually be the safest livestock anywhere in the world in rural Nepal. I think that's, sort of one of these sort of sad but also very poignant effects of how things worked. And I think, people need time also to come to terms with, the changes in their lives. And that's one of the things that I've observed, that creating a home is more than building a house. And that's one of the distinctions that we make in our writing on this theme, that people may build a structure which is a house and which is legitimate and recognized as complying with the terms of the Reconstruction program, but they still may not conceptualize it as their home in a kind of affective sense. And doing that takes some time. It requires people to live perhaps in that space, to hold rituals, to engage, have family visit, and to kind of do maintenance and to build out. So I think that's one of the things that we'll be seeing over the coming years, how people then sort of modify the structures that they built under the Reconstruction program and adapt their relationships to them. Yeah, and then finally, you asked the question about local government, and maybe I think other panelists might have more to say about that than me. I think the one point that I would like to make is that despite all of the critiques of it and the challenges that the newly elected officials have faced since 2017, that process of devolution really did enable previously marginalized communities to participate in local governance in new ways. And so I see that as one of the very positive changes that has happened, and that is, in a sense, unfolding alongside the emergent attention to disaster risk reduction. And I do think that there is, a significant role for local governments to play. And I think the way that they're doing that varies quite a bit across different localities. And that's exactly the point here, that we perhaps can't say anything universal about the way local governments work. But in some of what I've observed, newly elected officials are making efforts and are certainly better connected with their constituents in terms of understanding the challenges that they face and the specific geohazards that are there in their environments. And so they're able to kind of build upon that. Finally, I mean, your question about immigration status or other legal status is really important. And one of the things that we also looked at in relation to how people were able to access reconstruction subsidies was citizenship issues. And I mean, it's interesting, in Nepal, this is not necessarily a question of immigration status. It's a situation of the kind of existing status challenges of accessing citizenship or nagrikta in Nepal for many people who have been born and brought up in Nepal and have, not come from anywhere else, and yet due to some of the restrictive citizenship policies do have challenges in accessing documents. So there's a significant issue with statelessness in Nepal, and that's also something that has played into the reconstruction process. As Nimesh was already mentioning, the fact that people had to be verified as eligible beneficiaries meant that they had to have citizenship documentation already. And for many people, that wasn't possible for a whole host of reasons. And or also people's documents were often destroyed in the earthquakes. That was another very real issue. And the other element of this is that Nepal does have conditions of very high mobility, both internally, rural to urban migration, as well as externally, people migrating for wage labor. And those issues very much got caught up in people's ability to access support after the earthquakes, because in cases, for instance, where husbands were away working, like in the Gulf states, which was a very common circumstance, it was often difficult for women to access support from the government on their own terms because of the way certain administrative structures have been set up. So that's just one example of how mobility shaped people's access or lack thereof. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to ask Shobhana now to respond, but I'm also going to add 2 questions that have come in from the audience, Shobhana, because they relate more to media. I'm just paraphrasing. One is, how do you think the media could work to prepare messages that have useful scientific information for different phases within a same disaster event, especially in the context of the time lag from the side of the government, or the government's lack of capacity in terms of available scientific information. So that's one. What can the media do? That's one. The second one is, now I'm going to read this out in part, and it's actually for everyone, but Shobhana, there is a media element to it, but Nimesh, you may also want to pop in, as may the others want. The person who is asking the question is referring to their own research over here. We found accessing disaster relief and aid is influenced by party affiliations, as I'm assuming that's political party affiliations, race, caste, and gender geographies. Given this context, how can we bring the role of party, media, and donor politics into the disaster governance for Nepal? And what impacts could we think for the community's resilience to such disasters? Shobhana, these 2, along with the other things that Ramola mentioned, or anything else that you may want to comment about, if you could keep your comments brief. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So in Nepal, as everywhere else, sensational news sells. So media tends to focus on the aftermath of the disaster, really counting the lives that have lost, how it was, how bad it was, the houses destroyed, but it doesn't much help to the survivors. So media really, really needs to take a step back and reimagine the way of disaster risk communication, which is focusing more on DRR, DRM, and preparedness. So we really need to work on this. So, and oftentimes, there's a lot of brilliant research, scientific research that's been done on Nepal and elsewhere. And oftentimes the science is not communicated well to people, even though efforts are made, especially those who are the most vulnerable. So I think media needs to think about how they can communicate the science about DRR, disaster resilience to vulnerable communities in simple, easy to understand ways. Always keep it very simple. But I think communicate it in a way that's in colloquial language, communicated, especially I think in Nepal, even though only about half of the population speak Nepali language. So I think local language programming, focusing on indigenous knowledge is so important, really important. I think, and also, to be able to do this programming is to media really needs to understand who are the most vulnerable, where they live, what media channels they use. So I think, all of these really needs to be thought of. And this is something I think that's come up time and time again. And this is something we really addressed in the strategy I talked about that we're working together with the NDRMA as well. That's all been highlighted. So I think, I wanted to, there was a bit about, politics, so we ran programming actually for 4 years, starting with the immediate, response for people, lifeline programming. Then we slowly moved to reconstruction, then to alternative sources of reconstruction, such as retrofitting. So we ran daily radio, television, and also social media programming. And we've actually, my team and we've traveled to all of the 34 districts, not only the 14 districts, really running community outreach with communities who had actually lost their houses. And one of the major issues, really sitting under a peepal tree with the communities and the local leaders, actually having a conversation with them. One of the major issues that always came up was the tranches. There was really conflicting, I think, messaging being provided by the government. at that time. I mean, it went on for so many years, whether they get 300,000 or is it 50,000 or 100,000, do we get it, do we not get it? And this had been politicized so much. And as a result, I think, I mean, and everybody wanted, and then, you know, you suddenly had a politician because local elections were coming and everybody suddenly said, okay, you're all going to get 300,000. Why would it? I mean, if you're a really local farmer, you know, 300,000 versus 50,000, it's a no-brainer. However, I think if this also links back to the relationship between people and their houses that came up before, is that, you know, traditional Nepali houses are, I mean, yeah, I think many of us have been to Nepal, lived there as well, needs to have an attic on top of the houses to store our grains, to keep our livestock. This is the houses that we've all grown up in. But the new houses being offered for the 300,000 for, I mean, you know, being offered were just like, I mean, very small houses. So what we had was like the broken down houses were still there. So they didn't break these down. And then they had the 300,000 rupee house. But everybody was living back in the, so the reconstruction, that means all of the things, and NRA, it was like houses built, yeah, everything great. But people, actually, you have a relationship with your house and you do need a house, a big house, because livestock, grains, that's part of your life, your livelihood. So I think that relationship, I think it's something we've all been struggling with. Many communities are still living with it. So that's somewhat of a, I say, challenge that we've that's come up, and we see it quite often as well. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, from my side.
Yeah, we'll come back to you. Thank you very much. That was very, very illustrative, not least because I also think that you know, when you have a new living space that is differently codified, it's actually asking for a renegotiation of your own identity and lifestyle with that new space. And, you know, what do you do now with a really nice brand new house that doesn't have an attic? So you have to then find places to keep what you would like to keep, or you go back to. But thank you very much. That was very interesting. Nimesh, I'm going to bring you back into the conversation later, but I'm going to first invite Katie to respond. But before that, I'm going to read out a question that is for all of you. This includes Romola. So that all of you have time to think while Katie's speaking, and then Nimesh also responds. We should be wary of measuring the Nepali state against metrics not wholly in its control. Disaster governance also includes donors and other actors besides the state, and policies like BBB or owner-driven reconstruction didn't emerge out of thin air, but have a long history outside Nepal and were not necessarily the choice of people in the NRA either. I think we should clarify at each point that NRA is National Reconstruction Authority and not something else that comes to mind. That's one of the problems with acronyms. Okay, great. Katie, would you like to take on the points that Romola raised, as well as any of the other questions that we deal? I should remind you, or not remind you, but to say that you're very welcome also to comment on anything else that anyone may have said.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Romola, for the questions. So I think I'll just reflect a little bit on the politics of science question that was directed to me specifically. But I think also my response then does tap into some of the issues you raised around how interventions land, and also relate to the participation question too. So I want to go back to the National Geohazard Assessment that I introduced earlier. I mentioned that, well, actually, as background, in case for those of you that are less familiar, essentially local government contacted the centre if they were concerned about a particular settlement, the location, the risk posed by geohazards, and requested an assessment of that site. And now, as I say, it was a static assessment. It was undertaken at one point in time, and it led to a categorization, 1, 2, or 3. And 3 was essentially there was a recommendation for relocation. It was considered, not safe to stay. Relocation was recommended. The wording is such that they do talk about recommendation, but of course, how that was kind of perceived and understood by communities, and my own work across two communities that were designated as category 3, but where they took the decision not to relocate for varying reasons, attachment to place, strong links to the Gumbra in one particular area, and concerns about the new site that had been identified in the other location, whether it would meet their livelihood needs. Many factors at play, local politics, tensions with the other community, neighboring community, and so on. So this was undertaken, this sort of proactive approach to assessing the hazard. There was, if you look at the sort of spatial distribution broadly of the areas that were assessed and overlay that with data that we have on landslide occurrence, it's quite an interesting pattern. And certainly there are areas where we might have expected assessments to have taken place where they weren't. But as I say, it was a one-off, and we know that the hazard context changed, right? So some of these category 3 communities, essentially the landscape kind of healed, and it actually perhaps wasn't necessary for communities to relocate. Some category 2 communities, the situation actually worsened. So it required a sort of rolling assessment. And that's where I think sort of science came in to some extent on our project, being able to look at this dynamic hazard and to create some maps to show how it's kind of changing over time and so on. But there's a limit to how those maps can be used. And essentially it led to categorization of individual buildings and households, a risk score and so on, which is incredibly problematic. So it was taking risk information down to the local level, where in theory there was a demand for that kind of information. But that's problematic for many reasons too. How do you use that information in a way that works to support decision-making and empower people in their decision-making rather than exacerbating existing inequalities that we know exist? So this is something we're exploring more in the current project. I don't have the answers to this. I feel that we should be able to do better. We have potentially information about the kind of hazard context. We know it's problematic in terms of how it lands, and how do we work in such a way with the new local governments, recognizing what Sarah was saying about, that these new forms of local government have allowed marginalized voices to come through more. So how can we work in a way that kind of actually enables a dialogue that recognizes and values different knowledge and information, and how that can then be used for decision making? But I don't have many answers yet, but they're very, very important questions. So I do think that relates to the participation point, and definitely in terms of how these interventions were taken up and resisted. I've given you those 2 brief examples. Not everyone wanted to relocate. Others did, were unhappy. There are many stories that I'm sure we've all heard. And there are issues moving forward for sure in terms of how the landslide hazards managed as the environment continues to evolve and heal.
Great. Thank you very much. Nimesh, did you want to come in to pick up on the other 2 parts of the question that I had posed to
I guess.
And you also had 2 missing points from Ramola, who is waiting for the answer, no doubt.
Yeah, I guess I can respond to this point on disaster governance and how we also need to go beyond the state and look at the international actors and donors. And obviously, that's super important because disaster governance, and Kathleen Tierney, disaster sociologist, has a very interesting piece on disaster governance, and she defines this much more kind of complexity approach to disaster governance, including various stakeholders, but also at different scales, different levels. We think about disaster governance, but to me, I think that is a really one is a much more descriptive way of looking at disaster governance, who is involved and what level of disaster governance. But I think I'm more interested in a much more normative question, and that is like, linked to the issue of accountability, right? So on the one hand, we have these sort of faceless actors who have been, who brought this idea of owner-led reconstruction or from somewhere else, and they probably came to Nepal, and that has been translated into policy and practice. That is also one thing to think about. But at the end of the day, I think the main question is, what has state done, to protect people from disaster, or help people recover from disaster? And I think that's really a fundamental question about holding state to account. And I think that is really, we need to start thinking about in making that lines of accountability clearer, the channels of accountability clearer, and looking at the questioning about, because if you really think about, descriptively, there are different actors involved and who different ideas that come in. There's a constellation of different discourses, But at the end of the day, normatively, we should be thinking about whether state has done enough to protect its citizens. That's the fundamental responsibility as a state. What has it done? How it is recovered? So I think it is much more linked to the question of accountability. Secondly, I think linked to that, the point that Ramola made about risk communication, I think that links to the question, again, linked to the, who's responsible to define what risk is, whose risk, and also that links to the question about risk communication. So what if the risk communication fails? If the way that it has been communicated, who should be holding accountable? So that happened in Nepal. The main it happened in Nepal is the 2017 tornado example that I give. That killed over 30 people, and also more recently that Shobhana may give example of in the Melamchi disaster, right? So there's we know from the investigation by civil society, media report, that it was the failure of not having or lack of early warning system, right? So whose responsibility is it to set up those early warning system? If the early warning system fails, if they miscommunicate, who's to be held to account for that? So it is really sort of, we need to think about the idea of risk communication also to the larger system of governance, particularly I think the issue of accountability. And that's particularly important because then accountability is linked to trust. Unless people unless we are able to hold the authorities and people who are involved in accountable, it's very difficult to kind of engage people in their ability to prepare for disaster. Because people need to be trusting the system basically in order to be participating, engaging, understanding, cooperating with the state in terms of the management and sort of governance of risk. Finally, I think the point on what you mentioned, Roa, about the Nepal as a site of learning, I think that's really important, both as someone who's from research, as a researcher and ethnographer, but also looking at our own positionality, because I'm an accidental disaster researcher. I had no background, and I think Sarah and Katie has been doing disaster research in Nepal for a long time, but it was after the earthquake I became a disaster researcher. And so we also need to be reflecting on, and then I have a paper on that, it's just a cursory search on Wave of Science. You'll see that over 1,700 academic articles have been published on or about Nepal, since 2015 Nepal earthquake. Who is publishing it? This is also a huge question that we should be looking at Nepal as a site of research and this kind of gold rush to sort of and linking it to the larger debate about decadence. So, but that point also linked about the learning, also linked to the politics of learning and investigation, and again links back to the issue of accountability. With often government, now it's happening in more and more. I have a paper that I'm working on with a colleague on the Chamoli disaster in Uttarakhand last year. And often the disaster also triggers a politics of investigation, learning, and government, often the government, we saw that with the Chamoli disaster, the government take on the role to investigate about disaster, what caused disaster. But often that's not, there's no genuine interest to learn and kind of act on. It's not a scientific process, but it is mostly to deflate blame. It's a very much a tokenistic thing. So we also need to be very careful about who is doing this kind of learning, scientific investigation, because often that is not to do with the accountability, but it is mostly to deflate blame. So that's something that I wanted to draw attention to. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Ramola, did you want to come in?
No, I think that, I think the questions were really beautifully answered, and I really appreciate everybody's efforts to engage with sort of wide-ranging queries that I had in addition to the audience questions. So thank you again.
Sarah, did you want to come back?
Sure. Yeah, I have a few thoughts about things that have been said. I realized I wasn't able to answer the question earlier about the Treasury, depleted Treasury after COVID. And unfortunately, that's not something that I have up-to-date knowledge about. So apologies to that participant. I did want to take up the point about the donor landscape, which was made, and absolutely, I fully agree with those comments. As I mentioned in my introductory remarks, I think I highlighted a few times the role of the donors in this kind of multi-tiered process of framing disaster response and disaster governance oriented towards mitigating future risk. And certainly it is not only the responsibility of the NRA to kind of take responsibility or blame, to use the term that Nimesh just put out there, for some of the shortcomings of the program for the private housing reconstruction program or other elements of reconstruction, because yes, the kind of Nepali state actors are very much beholden to international donors and whatever trends or kind of keywords, buzzwords are there at a given moment in terms of how certain programming should be implemented. And that's something that we've also tried to engage with in our research as well. And there are some very particular ways in which the owner-driven reconstruction approach or the commitment to build back better, that's what BBB is in that context, was framed because of donor conditionality. So at the same time, I think what we need to recognize is this sort of nested levels of conditionality and then the kind of outcomes that generates. So while state actors are beholden to their donors, they are then, in a sense, passing the buck for accountability to citizens by developing these very, constrained, these programs for reconstruction that have significant constraints and criteria for compliance. And so part of what we documented was the way in which, in a sense, state actors were trying to blame individual house owners for not complying or not acting correctly, et cetera, to represent that to the donors as not.
Oops, I think we've lost Sarah suddenly. Sarah,
Yes, I hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we lost you in between. I just took it that you were angry, but turns out no. If you could just go back to, we heard you up to where you said you were talking about, just the last sentence we didn't hear, just the last bit.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say is that there are these kind of nested scales of accountability. So yes, of course, Nepali state actors are constrained by donors, but the question is then how do they deal with those constraints? Do they pass them down also to provincial and municipal levels of government and then to citizens in local context, or do they take responsibility for those constraints? Everybody is certainly acting in a very fraught and conditional environment in which it is complicated to achieve the kind of outcomes that I think people would desire. And certainly I'd like to acknowledge that I think there's a great deal of good intention within the NRA and other state agencies, as well as within the donor community. And I think overall, we can see that there have been really very many positive outcomes. And I think that's what we've been trying to emphasize. At the same time, there are areas where we could learn for the future. And I think also one of the things I wanted to say is that from the point of view of house owners who are trying to navigate these systems, it's often very unclear who the accountable actor is, whether it's the local government or the federal government or a NGO, and we haven't talked much about NGOs and their role in this whole process, or a kind of multilateral donor. And so from that perspective of kind of lived experience, it can look quite different. So analytically, it's good to parse this all out, but still we have these questions of what actually happens on the ground and how to deal with that. There was one other brief thing I wanted to say that I forgot to mention earlier, which is in regard to one of Ramola's questions about migration and legal status. I think one of the categories of people whom have suffered immensely and really not been talked about as much as some of the rural population, ironically, are rural to urban migrants who were living as tenants in Kathmandu and other regional centers at the time of the earthquake, who did not have any kind of land title or legal right to the structures that they were living in at the time of the earthquake, but may also not have access to or an easy way to return to wherever their citizenship is registered in rural areas. And so I think that category of urban poor, who are often migrants from outside of urban centers, has really had a difficult time, and that has to do with some of the legal issues around citizenship and the way in which residents and ownership are registered in Nepal.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Shobhana, I know you've raised your hand, but I'm just going to briefly ask Katie if she would like to respond to the whole question of non-state donors, etc. And because we are out of time, actually, so we should wrap up very soon. So Katie, do you want to go?
I'm happy for Shobhana. Please go ahead, Shobhana.
Katie, you can go ahead. I just missed, I think, something.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, Shobhana, did you want to say something?
Okay, yeah. So I think I just wanted to come back on the governance issue. Just to say, the DRRM Act and the action plan have focused on strengthening disaster governance at all three tiers of federal governance. But this is still an evolving concept and is yet to be translated into action, especially at the subnational and local government levels. And I think in our interactions, we've seen that in many parts of Nepal, locally elected representatives are not even aware of what their legal duties are to form local DRM committees, and to manage local funds. And this is where the role of media could be really, I think, important. So media could raise this issue to help strengthen disaster governance beyond the scope of Ministry of Home Affairs or the NDRRMA. So I think unless disaster governance is strengthened at the local level, it'll be difficult to reduce disaster risk and preparedness overall. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we must draw this to a close now. This has been extremely interesting and very, very engaging. And I want to thank everyone. I want to thank our participants, some of whom are actually watching from Nepal, where it is now very, very late in the night. But to everyone else watching from everywhere for your questions, for your involvement. I want to thank Ramola and Sarah for lingering with me and my idea of doing this event for over years, over months through the pandemic. We've come out at the other end. But I also want to thank each of our panelists individually, that is Sarah Schneiderman, Nimesh Dhungana, Katie Oven, Shobhana Pradhan, and Ramola Sanyal. It's very important that I say that, we are only able to do these events and these discussions, which are so very interesting, and so many of you are across so many time zones. We are only able to do it because all of you give so freely of your time, your intellect, your research, your ideas. Thank you very much, everyone.
And thank you, Nilanjan, also for persevering with us and putting together this fantastic panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I should say,
Thank you.